I'm here for the first time in the new venue. I used to come speak downstairs. Certainly, it's a beautiful location, dedicated to spiritual wellness, I presume, and meditation. Unfortunately, what I have to tell you will probably contribute a little bit to spiritual disturbance or lack of tranquility. I'm going to tell you about my life under the Nazis over the 5 years between 1939 and 1944. I was born in a Polish town in southern Poland of about 36,000 people, of whom 12,000 were Jewish. We were located about 100 miles east of Krakow, which you may have heard of, and about 200 miles from the German border. Town was a county seat. It had many administrative offices. It was a commercial center, a business center, etc. And we lived in a reasonable tranquility in Poland at the time. I was 10 years old in 1939 when the war broke out on September 1st, 1939, sunny Friday, and we heard air raid sirens. There were some bombs dropped on our town, and we knew the war was on. At first, I believed, being a patriotic boy, that the Polish army, which was rated pretty well on paper, will be able to withstand the German onslaught, and that is going to finally resolve the problem of Hitler forever. As you know, that didn't happen, and within 8 days, the German armies were approaching our town. While we didn't know specifically what that is going to mean for us, in reading the reports from Germany in prior months and weeks, we felt that nothing good is going to happen. So we, meaning our extended family at the time, my parents, my older sister and myself, as well as my paternal grandfather and his 3 unmarried children, my 2 aunts and uncle, decided to flee, hoping to escape to the east and give time for the Polish army to reorganize itself and perhaps be able to escape the German occupation. So we took a few belongings and we started walking at night. We walked at night because during the day the German Air Force was strafing the roads and killing the civilians where it was moving. And at night in those days the planes were not able to operate too well. So we walked all night long, arrived in a small town, and where we bedded down for early in the morning and to rest. And within a few hours we learned that the German troops have already cut off all the roads leading to the east. There was no escape and we were trapped. What that was going to mean to us became clear within a couple of weeks. That was the day of the observance of the Jewish New Year's, Rosh Hashanah, and on the second day of that holiday, SS unit arrived in town. The first task was to get to the synagogue. They took out the Torah scrolls, the holy parchments on which the first books of Moses are handwritten, and unrolled them on the ground and stomp on them, dance on them, and spit on them, and Then they set fire to the synagogue. It so happened that we rented a room in a small cottage directly across the synagogue, which was fronting a small square. And we were able to watch through the window what was happening. The Germans got hold of the sexton of the synagogue and tried to make him step on the Torah scrolls. He wouldn't do it, and so they wrapped the Torah around him and threw him into the burning synagogue. I could hear the screams. I was very, very frightened. We all were frightened, but I can only speak for myself. I was absolutely paralyzed with fear. I was sitting on the ground looking across what was happening. Some time later, we heard screams in the street, we heard shots, we heard sounds of doors being broken down, etc. It was very petrifying. Some time later, we hear rifle butts knocking on the door. The owner of the cottage with his wife, who lived in the same place, went to open the door. They asked him, and we heard it because we're just in a room off the hall, and they asked him if he lives there. He said yes. And then they asked him, is anybody else in the house? And he said no. And they took him and his wife and they left. Next day we found out that he was killed together with several hundred other Jews of that small community, buried in a mass grave outside the town. Now, one is frequently asked, how did you survive? And this situation points out that I didn't survive because I was smarter, more resourceful, or stronger, or whatever. You had to be lucky. If you just look at the situation, how did the owner of the house have the presence of mind to say that there was nobody else in the house? I mean, nothing in his experience would have indicated to him that, those people whom the Germans will pick up are going to be killed. And typically one obeyed authority in those days. And lying to the authority would be probably more, at least under the old criteria, would be more dangerous than telling the truth. Secondly, why didn't one of the Germans step into the hallway and look into the room just to take a look if he's telling the truth? They believed him. If they had, I wouldn't be here to tell you the story. So you had to be lucky. Later on that night, the thatched roof of the cottage we were in started smoldering from the sparks from the burning synagogue. Now we were caught really in a dilemma, whether we stay inside and burn to death, or else we try to get out and fall into the Germans' hands for whatever that meant, which we didn't know for sure. I, being the youngest, was sent out to try to find out a way through the back lanes and gardens of the various cottages, a route that we could escape out of sight of the Germans. And I did that. I hopped a few fences and I was looking around, seeing Germans in various corners of streets, trying to map out some way. As I was doing that, there was a cloudburst. A heavy rain fell, the smoldering fire was extinguished. Again, a very lucky circumstance, coincidence. We were saved again. The Nazi unit left the next morning. The town calmed down. We emerged from the cottage, found out what was going on. So there was no real reason to stay anymore, and we made our way slowly back to the town we came from. There, a series of ordinances that were put in force by the German occupiers. All Jewish children were forbidden to go to school. All religious worship was forbidden. Synagogues were converted either into stables or warehouses or what have you. All Jewish professionals were not allowed to practice their skills. Jewish stores and properties were expropriated. We were not allowed to travel any place. We couldn't even walk on the sidewalk. We had to walk in the gutter. And everybody over the age of 12 had to wear a white armband. It was a blue Star of David on their left arm. I, not being 12 yet, just 10, a little over 10, did not have to do that for the time being. And I was able to move around town a little bit easier without being immediately recognized as a Jew. All these ordinances, and there were many, many others, were under the penalty of death on the spot without any court proceedings. Just you could be shot at the whim of any German soldier. Occasionally the Germans would come in and raid the area of young people, men and women, for the labor, as laborers. Some of the people came back and some did not. Slowly, the Germans started to increase their oppression. They did it very gradually. And first they moved us all into a residential area of a few square blocks where we could still move around in and out of, but we all herded together. Sometime later, they built a fence around that area and closed it up and created a ghetto, which meant that nobody could get in and out without the proper papers. The only ones that could get in and out were those who were working for the German war machine, and they only had two gates which were guarded, and the whole area was surrounded by a high wooden fence, not a barbed wire or electrified barbed wire fence, just a simple fence. We were crowded, very crowded. People lived in rooms, as many as could sleep on the floor. People lived in stairways, attics, hallways, the street. There was no regular distribution of food. Occasionally there would be some potatoes and some bread distributed. People were dying of malnutrition, various diseases, and occasional German raids, which were always bloody and murderous. By the spring of 1942, the Germans began to implement their decisions that they made at the infamous Wannsee Conference, in which they decided to kill all Jews within their reach. What it meant in our area is that they brought in, again, SS units. Let me back off a minute. First, they brought in another 12,000 people from the surrounding area, Jews living in smaller towns and villages, in the fields, and they brought them in to the ghetto so that we all together. So if we were crowded before and hungry and food was sparse, it was much worse then. We're now about 24,000. conditions were close to being unbearable. Then they brought in a detachment of SS troops, a couple of armored cars, units with vicious dogs, and they declared total curfew. And then they declared there's going to be a deportation proceeding, in which they said that the people will be resettled in the territories which the Germans occupied in Russia, and they will have more food, and they'll have places to live, and it's going to be all better for them. The procedure was to divide the ghetto into 4 segments. Total curfew in one segment of the ghetto was driven out to be assembled on a square in the center of the ghetto, which used to be the old Jewish cemetery which the Germans just razed. The criterion for escaping the, quote, benevolent deportation was that if an adult worked for the German war machine, then the children and the spouse were permitted to pass into an area which was designated for those who worked for the Germans. The rest would undergo the deportation. It was very similar to what was depicted in Schindler's List. If you did see the movie, Krakow was in the same industrial administrative district that we lived in. All the procedures were the same. The movie was quite accurate in most of its descriptions and depictions of the deportations and selection processes. You saw the tables with Gestapo and SS officers going over people walking through and showing the documents and being able either to pass through that gauntlet or being rejected. Picture a hot July day, Tuesday, July 7th, 1942. That date is etched in my memory, and I'm citing it here to show that it is a historical fact supported by other independent documents. And there are many, many Holocaust deniers who say this has never happened, or if it happened, it wasn't as severe. The fact is, it did happen. I wish it didn't. And I just want you to know that I was an eyewitness to that, and there are not too many of us left. I was the youngest in camp later on, at the age of 13. With sometime in your future life, somebody will challenge the story or the facts. It's not a story, they're facts. If you remember, tell them you heard from an eyewitness who was there. Now it so happened that I lived again in a window, in a house with a window overlooking that square. And I saw this mass of people, roughly 6,000 of them, men, women, and children, sitting on the ground. Hot day. Mothers begging the SS guards for some water for the children, being beaten mercilessly as a result. So finally, everything was quieted down, only being interrupted by German laughter and German barking out orders. And it was a surreal scene etched in my memory. At the end of the day, some perhaps 10% of the 6,000 people passed through the selection process. and the rest was driven, not in trucks, but by whips and vicious dogs, towards the railroad station. Whoever could not maintain the forced march was shot on the spot. The road leading to the railroad station was scattered, strewn with bodies. We didn't know what happened, but later we were told by a Polish railroad man that the men were driven to the railroad, the people were driven to the railroad station, packed into freight cars, 80 to 100 to a car, and then the train was moved towards Belzec, town of Belzec, and in the town, the German railroad crew took over the train, drove it a few more miles to the death camp of Belzec. Belzec was nothing but a death factory. There was no work in there, purely extermination facilities. Nobody, to my knowledge, has ever escaped Belzec. People escaped Treblinka, people escaped Auschwitz, people escaped Majdanek, people escaped Sobibor. Nobody escaped Belzec. About 500,000 to 600,000 people were murdered in Belzec. The whole purpose was just to kill people. When the Germans were finished, they blew up and erased all trace of it. There's some very faint remnants of it, but you have to look very far to find them. Train came back empty. The same procedure was repeated on July 10th, 14th, and 17th of 1942. By the end of that period, out of some 24,000 people, there were about 2,000 left in the work camp. The rest was killed, including were both my grandfathers, a number of my aunts and uncles. My mother and my father each had 6 siblings, many first cousins, second cousins, all my school friends, all the kids that I played with as a child. All that was gone. No reason, but senseless hatred, senseless murders of people with potential hopes and aspirations. Numbers are called. These were individuals, each with their own dreams, which were not allowed to be fulfilled. And the children, so many children went to the death innocently. My father was away already at the time, and we didn't know it then, but he was murdered in another town 50 miles away, buried in a mass grave with another 20,000 Jews. My mother worked for the German railroad, so my sister and I were able to pass through the selection process, and we were put into the work camp. Even though the Germans said that whoever works for the German war machine, their spouse and children will be able to stay with them. Within 4 weeks, they took every child and every person that did not work for the German war machine and deported them to Belzec. So that was again a broken promise, not that you can trust the German promises. I volunteered to work on the railroad. I worked in at the age of 13 as a laborer putting down railroad tracks, carrying rails, carrying railroad ties, also building a roundhouse for locomotives, which involved carrying sacks of cement, pushing wheelbarrows full of concrete, and carrying bricks and mortar and all this stuff. Back-breaking work at all hours. My sister, who was 3.5 years older than I, decided she's going to try to make a break. She's going to try to escape. Now, escape per se was not difficult. The problem was there was no place to go. So she managed to get away and made her way to the railroad station, where she hoped to take a train out of town, and where she would be less likely to be recognized. Well, however, she was pointed out to the Germans by a Pole who was rewarded with 1 quart of vodka and 2 pounds of sugar. That was the going ransom. She was arrested and ultimately wound up in Auschwitz, where she was sent to the gas chamber. It's going back to the theme of circumstance and luck and being crucial to your survival. We are told by people who were in the same transport as my sister was and who survived, and they told us after the war, that when they arrived in Auschwitz, they were arrayed in a column, and infamous Dr. Mengele was going through his selection process, pointing with his whip, pointing to his right, for the people to perhaps stay in for another few weeks in the labor facility, and to the left, which was direct path to the gas chamber. My sister, was in the rear of the column, and he got tired about midway through and sent everybody else in the rear of the column directly, without any selection process, to the gas chambers. At about the same time, unbeknownst to me then, but I went through a very similar situation where I was in a column in the camp I was in, and there was a selection process for the people to, the Germans expected us to see whether they were still capable of work, and those who couldn't, or whom they considered weak, was sent directly to Auschwitz. Again, the same situation. I was in the front of the column. I passed. Many people in the rear of the column were sent away. And that is a trivial detail, but crucial. Where do you stand in the column? You can't control that. What happens? Is the front good? Is the back good? You don't know. These are the things of fate plays cruelly with your life. Well, sometime later, the Germans decided they're going to convert us into a forced labor camp, which meant that SS took over the administration of the camp. We were all shaved, all our possessions were taken. We were issued some clothing which was not the typical blue and gray stripes you see in the pictures of the survivors, but it was just ill-fitting clothing which was painted in a box pattern with red paint, just to distinguish us from normal individuals. Men and women were separated. I was separated from my mother, and we were going the same routine, working for the Germans, except that now whatever German enterprise we worked for had to pay the SS for our services. They were really, really slaves. A day consisted of getting out in the morning, and could be before dawn in the winter, having to stand in a column in a square and be counted. If anybody died during the night, his body had to be dragged and kept and put in its place so that the count would be correct. Then we were given a tiny slice of bread, some black liquid, which never saw a coffee bean, and marched off to work in cadence, worked all hours, came back at night. Whole thing was repeated. We were again given a slice of bread and some soup, which was made of kale and some other greens. And you were very lucky if you got a piece of potato in that soup. This was going on day in, day out. We didn't know what day it was. We didn't know what month it was, except from the weather. And periodically there were selections. People were dying of starvation. People were dying because the Germans shot them for whatever reason. And by September of 43, we were down to 150 people. Imagine, out of the 24,000 that started in July of 42, we were down to a handful. At that time, most of us worked in the area of the former ghetto, which was still surrounded by a fence and not open to the public. It had a lot of furniture and dinnerware and all kinds of stuff that the Germans wanted. When we sent the good stuff to Germany, and they burned the bad stuff, including many, many books, and the Germans said, sold at an auction, flea market type of situation, the other stuff to Poland. The Germans didn't even bother to have two camps at that time. They all put us in a single barrack, the men and women together, so I was reunited with my mother. Both still alive. Sometime October, early November, we got a note, not by mail. There was still some working details who worked outside the camp, and the woman who was my nursemaid and nanny surreptitiously passed a note to the passing prisoners, which said that if we can make our way out, she'll try to save us, which was really the first hopeful sign we have seen in many a year. And in spite of that encouraging note, we agonized over it. We agonized over it for really three reasons. One was we felt we were not sure we have the right to risk her life and that of her husband and then 3-year-old daughter to save us. If we're caught and they're killed because of us, we felt that would be a very grave responsibility. Secondly, we felt similarly, if we escaped successfully, and if the Germans, as there was the want, would take reprisals and hang or kill 10 or 20 other prisoners, can we take their death on our conscience? And finally, if we get out and get caught on our own, not before we reach our house yet, we'll probably be tortured. We'll die a very painful death. And are we ready to do that? Rather than die en masse. Well, the second consideration just became a mood because the 150 people who were there said we're all going to try to make a break for it. There were not that many guards at the time. We often worked in the former ghetto, in the empty area. There was clothes in there that we could exchange stuff for our red painted garb. And it was November. Dusk came early. Curfew didn't start until 8 o'clock at night. So we tried to make it. And we did. We were scattered in all directions. And we made our way, my mother and I, to this woman's house. There, she put us in a cellar. She lived in an apartment house on the market square, the central square of the city. She had a 2-room, a modest apartment. Each apartment there was assigned a cellar for storage, potatoes, cabbage, coal if you had one. It was a windowless, sort of almost like a dungeon, brick walls, curved vault-like ceiling, but not even 6 feet high, with dirt and some straw on it to sleep on. The door was a heavy wooden door that was padlocked from the outside, and that's where we stayed. Every morning she would come and look around if there are any other neighbors there, because there were another 6 or 7 cellars around. Each apartment had one assigned to it, and people would come in the morning to pick up their supplies, as the case may be. So she would, if there was nobody around, she would come with a pail as if she was going to bring some potatoes up, put some food in the pail, open the door, leave the food for us, empty the slop pail, and then lock us up again. You might wonder, how did we stand this? Let me tell you, I really don't know, but it was better than the camp. We were mostly in a semi-conscious state. We didn't talk to each other for the fear of being overheard. We had a small kerosene lamp which we occasionally lit, but we were afraid that the light might leak out. The door wasn't that solid. So we just vegetated. After about 4 months of this, she came in one morning and said that the German, all residents of that apartment building got an order to vacate within 24 hours because the Germans need the house for their own purposes. She didn't know what to do with us. So we told her, look, you do whatever is right for you, and don't worry about us, just tomorrow when the time comes, open the padlock and we'll try to sneak out and make our way wherever. Well, she didn't give up. She went to her sister, who lived in about 2 miles away, in a little cottage, a 2-room bedroom and living room and everything else, and a kitchen, and the sister had a small storage room. So she persuaded her sister to take her in with her family. Her sister was a widow with 2 boys, one older, one younger than myself, and take us into the storage room. She came, she told us, and we said, fine, we're certainly not going to go together. Just at dusk we'll open the cellar door and we walked towards your sister. We knew where it was because she used to take me there when I was a child. We did that. the irony of it is, and another fortuitous circumstance, that the very night that we left that cellar, there was a water break on the main square. The cellar was flooded with water and mud. And had we been there, we would have been killed. It would have been discovered. She would have been killed with her family as well. I was there in 75 for the first time back, and the cellar was still full of mud, as it was in 94 and also last year. So, speaking of luck, the situation which created a major problem turned out to be for our good. Well, we stayed there in that storage room for a few months more, from about March till July 31st. We were liberated by the Soviet Army. Now, if I look back on these years, I cannot express and give enough credit to the heroism of this woman and her sister and her husband, how they risked their lives to save us. I mean, I don't know whether in the same situation I would have the courage to do that. There's so much at stake. But while I saw and witnessed what's worse than man, I also saw what is most sublime in man. And as a result, I do believe that each of us has a divine spark in them, a spark of goodness that we need to nurture and develop. My experience points to the abysmal situation that can happen when people hate, when people have, even not about hatred, just the Germans treated us as if worse than ants. It was just absolutely total attempt of dehumanizing us. So I'm alerting you to the dangers of people, of demagogues and others who tend to dismiss other groups of people for whatever reason. Gender, sex, race, religion, color, what have you. It's absolutely inhuman, and it is going to lead to the worst situations that one can imagine. You are at a university. The primary function, in my opinion, of your education is to learn how to think. And I plead with you to think rationally, to look and see what this course of action would lead. Is there any way worse to degrade anybody for whatever reason, as trivial as it may sound, like hazing to join a fraternity or sorority? Is it worse to denigrate anybody? It isn't. It's very dangerous. Everybody is entitled to our respect until they lose it by their action. So I plead to you, have this in mind in future life and act accordingly. Thank you very much. I'll be glad to answer any questions you might have. Don't be embarrassed. I'll accept all questions. Yes.
Where did you go after the Soviets liberated you and you had to...
Well, a long track. The war was still going on until May of '45. Then I made my way to Czechoslovakia in the south. Then across Czechoslovakia into the U.S. zone of Germany, Bavaria. And I was in a displaced persons refugee camp under the UNRWA auspices, which was then the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Agency, for 3.5 years. And finally came to the United States in 1949. Yes?
Was your nanny, like the person that put you in her salad, was she German or Jewish?
Polish.
She's Polish.
She's Polish. I lived in Poland. She was a Polish Catholic Jewish woman. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Have you gone back to the places
Yes.
you stayed?
Yeah, I inferred that I did go there in '75 and '94 and last year. Yes, I did
Was
go
that
there.
incredibly hard, though?
Pardon me?
Was it incredibly hard to see it? And how'd you deal with it? Did you go with your family now?
I went with my wife the first time in 1975. By that time, her sister has already passed away, but my nanny and her husband were still alive. I didn't find it hard. I found it strange. I found somehow, first of all, one impression I had was that all the streets and all the buildings, the streets were narrower and the buildings were smaller than I remember them. Remember, I was a kid when I left. But I also felt, strangely enough, that the past, once I started walking these streets, that the past was the reality. And my present situation, being an American coming to visit, was kind of a fiction. I felt that for a while, but I did not find it traumatic. I found it very, very, very sad. Looking at the ruins, I went to visit my father's mass grave, and that was sad, but it wasn't overwhelmingly difficult. I'm glad I did go. I'm very glad I did go. Yes.
In order to live in the present rather than the past, how do you stand as far as forgiveness?
There's no forgiveness. I can't forgive. I mean, it's not mine to forgive. I can only forgive for the death of my father and my sister and my father. And it's not mine to forgive. I don't know who was the individual. I do not forgive. I do not forget. I do not hate the Germans as a nation, because if I did that, I would reduce myself to the same mindset that they had. I have no problem dealing with Germans who are younger than I. I am very uncomfortable with dealing with Germans who are older than I, because I don't know what they've done. For forgiveness, you need true repentance. As far as I know, among the convicted Nazis or suspected Nazis, there was no indication of repentance ever that I am aware of. I mean, I'm not all-knowing, but I know there are groups, including one that interacts in Boston, of children of Nazi officials who meet with children of survivors. And I know that in the other generations have a genuine regret and concern. But the elements of forgiveness are not there. I don't think will ever be. Yes?
How did you keep in touch with the nanny and her husband, and more so, do you still know the 3-year-old daughter?
Oh yes, oh yes. I'm in touch. They both died, the nanny and her husband died. The daughter is the only one alive in the whole scenario. The two brothers also died. One of them died very painfully last summer of lung cancer, and I was there with him for the last week. I went there. I am constantly in touch. I'm in touch with the widow, and I send them help, and whatever I do is insignificant to what they've done. But I was very, very good, very deep friends with the man who just passed away. We were very close. We corresponded. My Polish is worse and worse, so hard time. And I tell you, they did not have a telephone. Nobody had a telephone. And the man was very sick with lung cancer this last May, a year ago. And the doctor asked the authorities that he needs a telephone because they released him from the hospital when I told them that I was coming, so he could see us on the ground, on his home grounds, rather than the hospital where there were 6 patients to a room. So the doctor sent to the authorities, they didn't give him a telephone. He said it's necessary for his case, he needs immediate help. His daughter has a phone and a cell phone and everything else, but we kept in touch. Yes.
What do you make of the fact that you survived against such tremendous odds?
What should I make? Do I think that I was singled out and the divine providence interacted? It's very hard for me to believe that. Because, first of all, I don't consider myself worthy of that type of singling out. And second of all, if I was singled out, what about all the others? What about all these millions? Why did God make the decision to pick on me? I'm an ordinary person. I'm sure there were much more worthy, talented people that could have contributed more to the world. So I can't rationalize that. I can't accept that. I think it's just lucky circumstance and the act of love and courage of some people.
When and how did you begin to speak about the experience to your family now and also to complete strangers and others?
I really did not speak until the early 70s. First of all, there wasn't that much interest at the time. My children, I have 4 children, knew that we were a little bit different, but we were trying to bring them up in a typical American middle-class family. We moved to the suburbs when we could, and we brought them up, just their average activities. However, they had my mother a survivor, and my wife's parents were survivors. So they knew there was something different about us. Then I was asked in the late 60s by the editor of a publication, a reward-winning publication of the Synagogue I used to belong to, and to just recall my experiences. And I wrote a series of articles over a span of 3 years, about 10, which essentially depicted what I said now, except in somewhat greater detail. That's how my children really learned about it. In 72, the first 72, 73, the first incidents of Holocaust denial became public. And we were asked times have changed, and we were asked if we would like, my wife and I would like to speak, and we have done it ever since because we feel it's very, very important to dismiss the pseudo-scientific, pseudo-historical assertions of people who just not only distort facts, but just conveniently omit facts from for their own purposes, whatever they may be. Not the least of which is the latest case of the, quote, respected historian David Irving in England. So I've been speaking ever since. I find it's an obligation, as I said, there are not that many of us left. Future generations. I mean, we've been taped for various places, have been taped here. It is necessary, but it's very important for young people to actually see a person who is a witness, hear directly. I think that makes more of an impact than resources and books and so on. And I know some historians claim that the testimony of survivors, as they say, is notoriously inaccurate. I beg to differ. I'd like some historian to tell me that to my face. Yes?
Did your nanny have any problems after the war? Did people who were Christian know what she had done?
No.
Did she want people to know?
No, absolutely not. I lived in the same town for nine months, 9 after liberation. And I could only visit her, sneaking into her apartment at night. She absolutely did not want her neighbors to know that she was, quote, a Jew lover. They could have probably ostracized her or whatever. Now, I went through the elaborate process to have her recognize, her acts recognized of her family by the Yad Vashem, which memorizes these incidents, and if the people are alive, they plant a tree in the alley of the righteous Gentiles, which is at in Jerusalem. And I went to the council and got all the papers ready, and they said they would do it, but she would have to come out. She would have to go to Israel to plant a tree, and they'll have a ceremony and everything else. She wouldn't do it. She just wouldn't do it. So, again, the anti-Semitism in Poland was pervasive then, and still is to a large extent. As a matter of fact, I did have to flee Poland in '45 because of anti-Semitism. I did put her name on the block of granite at the United States Holocaust Museum, and her sister's name. State of Israel gave them a token subsidy monthly when they were alive. They were sending them some little money, but she never wanted to publicly acknowledge her heroism, which is a sad, sad comment on the state of mind of people. Yes?
Why did you decide to come to America? Did you consider going to Jerusalem or living there?
Yes, I could definitely. Personally, I wanted to go to Israel, but I tried, as a matter of fact. I left my mother one time and tried, but the road wasn't clear. There was a situation where the British were preventing all immigration. They were sending people to Cyprus. I started out and I was turned back essentially. And my mother caught up with me and she begged me. She didn't want to go. She didn't want to live anymore into situations of stress. She wanted to return to some form of normalcy. And that's why I came to the United States.
With there any other religions other than Jewish, or like nationalities in these camps?
Where I was?
Mm.
No, because it was a small camp.
Right.
But there were others, the major camps, they had gypsies. There were some Poles who were arrested for anti-German activities and killed. And Germans who were anti-Nazis, who were in concentration camps. In every country, there were people who were not Jewish who if they resisted the Nazis, they wound up in concentration camps. But not we were small. We started with about 2,000 people, and nothing, not one of the major things. There are countless of these places. All our purpose was just to provide our labor, and then until we could, and then it's over. Well, thank you very much.